So now we've got Darwin sort of squared away. We've laid the basis for modern evolutionary theory. Modern evolutionary theory relies on population genetics, not what's happening at the individual level with genetics, but what's happening at the population, what's happening between us. Now, I told you last semester, I'll tell you again, if I start talking above your heads, if I start using words that you don't know, stop me and ask me to explain it, because I am, my training is in population genetics. I was an evolutionary biologist to begin with, evolutionary genetics. So this was like my thing. And I get super excited about it, and just like anybody who's like bilingual, you switch into another language and you don't even realize it. So stop me if I'm using weird words you've never heard of. We're going to begin by defining a bunch of huge words that you may have heard, but now take on entirely different meanings, like the word population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that occupy the same environment. Shortly, we will define what is a species. That concept is way harder than you ever thought it was, because we all have an idea of what a species is. For now, let's just call a species any group of organisms that can interbreed. You get a bunch of salmon together, a big river full of salmon, it turns pink, because those are a group of organisms in the same place at the same time who are ready to mate. Populations typically are defined by sex. They're defined by mating potential. Groups of organisms that can produce viable, that is, living offspring that can reproduce through sexual reproduction. You might have a group of horses. I guess they're called a herd. A herd of horses. They are a population at the same place at the same time that can produce baby horses. But what would happen if you took a horse and a donkey and you put them together? You get a mule. Can a mule reproduce? No, it's sterile. A horse and a donkey can, in fact, engage in mating. They can produce an offspring, but that offspring is not, that offspring is sterile. So those then would be considered different species, according to this concept. Over time, populations change. You start off with one particular set of circumstances, and that circumstances over time shifts due to slight changes in maybe mutations, polymorphisms arise, new traits come about. Think about the original Congress. Who was in the original Congress? George Washington. Whole bunch of old white guys. Pretty much, that was the original first Congress. The modern Congress, still primarily, not, a bunch of old white guys. But, there are people of color. There are women. There are women in Congress. This is crazy. That's totally different than the first Congress. Over time, slowly, there are changes. That is a dynamic population. These changes occur due to polymorphisms. New traits suddenly appear. They are poly, meaning many, morph, meaning form. Many different forms. For instance, here are two forms of sheep, a white sheep and a black sheep. In nature, originally, we probably didn't have white sheep. Because think about it, if you're a big white sheep, you are a big target. Does that make sense? You're easily seen out on the fields. That's why we like white sheep. Our ancestors, the shepherds, really like white sheep because you can find them easily. Black sheep are much harder to find, so we bred that out. Some other people thought maybe dyeing wool. It's easier to dye white wool than black wool. But you have a polymorphism that arises, and then one way or another, one is selected for. The causes in polymorphisms are genetic. They're not due to you working out over your life and suddenly changing. Polymorphisms are caused by genes that exist as two or more alleles in the population. Have we talked about, remember alleles in Bio 101 where we talked about, I think, Mendelian genetics? You have one allele versus another. You might have an allele that is GATTACA, and that might make something, I don't know, purple. Yep. I always resort to Gattaca. You might have another gene that is GATTTCA. Well, suddenly, you've got a slightly different code here. That changes the amino acid sequence. It might mean that the protein is completely non-functional. If you have a non-functional protein in this case, you have no purple pigment made, so it's white. One change in the alleles. You now have two distinct alleles for the same trait. They are polymorphic genes. The most common type of polymorphic allele is what's known as the SNP, the single nucleotide polymorphism. This is a SNP because you have one nucleotide that was changed. They're by far the most common. Sickle cell anemia is caused by a single nucleotide polymorphism. One nucleotide at one location along the entire gene is changed, leading to a distinct form. Here we've got another example of single nucleotide polymorphism. The center nucleotide was replaced. So if you have GGC and you replace it with GAC, when the DNA goes to replicate, you get an entirely new heritable change. It's important to note that these mutations occur on the DNA, not the RNA. If they occurred on the RNA, they wouldn't be hereditary. So now we have two distinct alleles. Remember, with alleles, they occur at the same locus or the same loci in at a chromosome. Over here, we have one on the P arm of this chromosome. It's an allele for purple flowers. At the same place on the homologous chromosome, we have the same allele, the same gene, but a different allele. This one's broken. Alleles are super important for understanding. You need to understand what alleles are because without alleles, you get no variation. Without variation, you get no evolution. I'm big on alleles. So I think I told my 101 story. I'll tell you guys a story real quick. My daughter's middle name is Allele. I know, that's how cool I am. It was a super fun story. My wife she was our first child. I was in graduate school. I had no insurance. She was like the $25,000 baby. Yeah, she's going to be paying that off the rest of her life. I kept the receipt. So my wife and I, well, my wife's going to give birth. I'm not. I'm just like there. I'm along for the ride. They had a very nice bed for me in the place. It was cool. We go to the hospital. She's decided that she's going to have a natural birth. And I was like, are you sure? Because you're not big on pain. And she's like, I don't want drugs in my system. And I was like, are you sure? She's like, no. And then she goes to give birth. And she's like, I need drugs in my system. It is very important. And I was like, okay, we'll get the guy. He'll be here soon. She's like, no, he needs to be here now. So she started off, no drugs. Then she switched over to needs to have a cocktail of drugs directly inserted into her spine in order to get this kid out. She and I had a discussion about what we're going to name the child. I said I wanted to call her Allele. And she said, no, her name's going to be Kira Victoria. I was like, really? And I said, but I really like Allele. I think we should name her Allele so that when she goes to college and she's learning this stuff, she can be like, Alleles are my middle name. And then I was like, no. I said, okay, fine. So we went to the hospital. Wife's like, ah! And I'm like, ah, because my hand's being squeezed to death. I still have scars. And they put this thing in her. She starts apologizing to everybody because she realizes, she's like, oh, I feel better now. I'm really sorry I called you the devil or something. And the baby comes out and everyone's like, oh, it's so cute. And I was like, oh, wow, it looks like a monkey. I was so tired. I was so tired. I looked at her and I was like, that is the ugliest baby I've seen. And then I was like, oh, wait, it's backwards. So my wife's, we were holding this baby, and we're like, so what are we going to name her? And she's like, we're going to name her Kira, it's like Kira Victoria. Yeah, it was Kira Victoria. And I was like, okay, everybody's happy. And then my wife fell asleep because she was still on drugs. And then the nurses come in with the paperwork. And she said, so we don't want to wake her up. You need to sign the birth certificate. And what's her name? I was like, Kira Allele. Kira Allele. And then it stuck because it was way too hard to go back and change that after it had been. Anyways, so I win that one. But a big reason for doing that, one, now she can tell everybody my middle name's Allele, and she absolutely, if she ever meets any of you guys in public, she will judge you on whether or not you understand what her name means. Two, she absolutely judges every one of her teachers, because if they don't know, she's like, well, you're not worth teaching me then, are you? And three, now that she's learned to write in cursive, it goes like this. The end. Alleles are super important. They do cause variation. You need that variation for evolution. If an organism is diploid, which most of us, all of us are, but some organisms are diploid, they're going to have two genes that match exactly. If they match exactly, if there is no variation, they are termed homozygous. Remember that? Good. Good. It's like a Celine Dion song. If they're at the same locus on two homologous chromosomes, you've got two different alleles. They're heterozygous. Homo meaning same, hetero meaning different. Zygous meaning zygous.